Good day. Today is Saturday, 26th July 2025, and before I turn to the topic, which will probably take up the longest time in this program, which is the conflict in Ukraine, I think I must say something about the situation in the Middle East, the crisis in Gaza, and the various diplomatic moves that are now underway in connection with it. The first thing to say is that pictures are appearing from Gaza which are becoming increasingly harrowing. They show widespread hunger and famine in the territory. I don't think there's any dispute or controversy about the fact that this is taking place. The Israeli authorities, of course, deny responsibility, at least in their official public statements addressed to the outside world. I'm told that their internal statements are different. The point is that Israel has overall control of the territory, overall control of the access points, and under international law, it is therefore responsible for the welfare of people inside the territory. This is a well-established position under international law, and simply saying that the thing is taking place and that Hamas is in some way responsible for what is happening in Gaza and that Israel isn't, well, I don't think that is acceptable. Anyway, in the meantime, even as these pictures appear, Western governments appear to be paralyzed, though the international community outside the West, I should say, is looking upon these events with growing horror. Now, I say Western governments are paralyzed. President Macron of France has announced that France proposes to recognize Palestine as a state. He will be the leader of the first big country in the West to take that step. And some of the other countries, the United States, Germany, seem very hostile to this idea. They continue to support Israel. And support Israel, of course, the Israeli government is strongly opposing this decision of President Macron's. Lindsey Graham, the US Senator, who's of course an outspoken supporter of Israel, has made some very interesting comments. I say interesting comments, strange comments, which he's published on X. The French government's decision to recognize a Palestinian state is curious and disturbing on multiple levels. I am certain this will embolden Hamas and make a ceasefire more difficult. More difficult in what respect? This conflict began in October 2023. We are now in July, the end of July 2025. We are coming close to the 2-year point in this conflict. There's been endless numbers of attempts to organise ceasefires. There was a brief ceasefire brokered by Donald Trump's envoy, Steve Witkoff, back in January. How, in light of the fact that there's been no ceasefire since October 2023 that has lasted for any significant period of time, can one honestly say that a decision by the French government to recognise Palestine as a state is going to make ceasefire negotiations more difficult? If they were so much less difficult, then presumably we would have a ceasefire by now, and these events that are playing out in Gaza would not be happening. Anyway, that's one thing that Senator Graham has said. He then goes on to say, in addition, there are some questions that come to mind. Who's in charge? What are the borders and boundaries? What is the governance structure? Does Hamas stay involved politically, or militarily? Is the West Bank and Gaza part of a single state? Are they allowed to have an army? Does the education system change? Other than these few missing details, it seems like a foolproof plan. Well, I'm going to ignore the sarcasm in the last paragraph. In fact, we can answer pretty much all of Senator Graham's statements. What are the borders and boundaries? They are the internationally recognized borders, as agreed in UN Security Council Resolution 242 of 1967. Just saying. I say that, obviously, boundaries and borders can be negotiated, but I don't, for the moment, see any need in terms of recognition of whatever entity is established in Palestine, political entity, maybe not established, but recognized in Palestine, to dispute the borders that were agreed, including by the United States, back in 1967 in Security Council Resolution 242, which was, by the way, proposed by the British government. What is the government structure? Again, it is not a complicated question. It is that of the Palestinian Authority, which is recognized as the international representative of the Palestinians. Whether, of course, it really is that is another question, but that is an internal question for the Palestinians themselves to resolve. And if we go on to Senator Graham's other questions, does Hamas, what is the governance structure? Does Hamas stay involved politically or militarily? Is the West Bank and Gaza part of a single state? Well, the answer to the last is that yes, it is. To go back to what I said, Resolution 242 essentially recognizes the West Bank and Gaza as part of a single state. I don't think this is in any way controversial. Does Hamas stay involved politically or militarily? That is an internal question of whatever state is established. Are they allowed to have an army? Well, most countries that are independent and internationally recognized do have armies. Does the education system change? The nature of the education system of any state is generally considered an internal matter. So I think that Senator Graham's attempts to suggest that there are complications and difficulties, when analysed properly, we see that these all evaporate into the mist. Now, to say this, a Palestinian state which is recognised at the present time is not a Palestinian state that is in control of its internationally recognised territory, which to repeat again, is the territory effectively, essentially recognised, not just in 1967, by the way, as part of its territory, but in many subsequent legal documents and public declarations that I'm not going to discuss or go into the detail of. Clearly, there will have to be detailed negotiations. Those negotiations may modify some of the issues. There may be discussions about boundaries. There may even be issues and discussions about internal governance and even the education system. But as I said, none of this is a reason, none of these points that Senator Graham is raising are reasons for not recognising a Palestinian state. Whether that state will, of course, achieve wider recognition is a big question. Whether recognising a Palestinian state at this time has any bearing at all on the crisis in Gaza is a further big question. I, for the record, don't think at the moment that it will. Supposedly in Britain, there is an internal dispute within the British government about whether to join President Macron and recognise a Palestinian state. I understand that some other European countries, Spain, Ireland obviously, have already moved or are moving also in that direction. But as I said, ultimately, the major criticism that can be made of President Macron's decision is that it is a token decision, that it doesn't address the actual realities of the situation on the ground in Gaza at this time. Now, there were supposed to be negotiations in Qatar with a view to trying to get a ceasefire. Those negotiations, in which Steve Witkoff, on behalf of the United States, participated, seem to have led nowhere. There is still the unresolved question of the hostages, though again, one has to say one is aware of the situation with the hostages, but there is also the far greater humanitarian crisis that is playing out in Gaza, which ought to be, in my opinion, an even higher priority at this time. Anyway, the ceasefire negotiations failed. Prime Minister Netanyahu called back his negotiators. I don't get the impression that he is especially focused on a ceasefire at this particular time. In fact, my sense is that even as the humanitarian crisis in Gaza is playing out, the conflict there continues and is, if anything, still intensifying. Now, last year, throughout 2024, there was sustained diplomatic action. Diplomatic action in the United Nations. There were repeated attempts to organise resolutions in the Security Council. Eventually, resolutions did start to pass. There seemed to be movement towards getting a resolution, a strong resolution, in the UN General Assembly. Then the American election happened. A new president took office. The president seemed to be interested in achieving a ceasefire in Gaza. He instructed Steve Witkoff to try to negotiate one. There were complex negotiations which took place. There was that brief negotiation which led to a ceasefire in Gaza for a few weeks in January and early February. But since then, one gets the sense that everything has come to a stop, and the president himself seems to have lost interest in this matter. My view is that the international community outside the West, for a time, was prepared to leave the new president time and space in order to start delivering on some of the things that he was saying. I think that point is now rapidly running out. I don't think much of the international community outside the West is especially impressed by what President Macron has done, or Prime Minister Starmer says, or his officials in his government say he might do. I think that we are probably before long going to see diplomatic action resume in a sustained way in the Security Council and in the United Nations. And on that point, I should say that there is now apparently a discussion underway between Iran, a meeting being prepared between Iran and Saudi Arabia in order to coordinate their positions. I said that there was a diplomatic will after the new president took office to give him time and space to see if he could sort things in Gaza out. I think another factor that played to that was Donald Trump's attempts to try to achieve some kind of normalization of the situation between the United States and Russia, a normalization of relations between the United States and Russia. And I think that the Russians also did not want to take action in the United Nations and in the Security Council especially, which might affect the progress of that and perhaps any further steps that the president was taking with respect to achieving some kind of peace settlement or resolution to the conflict in Ukraine. Given that the process of normalization of relations between the United States and Russia has now come to a complete stop, given that the negotiations to try to end the conflict in Ukraine are going nowhere at all, I suspect that the Russians, who last year were playing the lead role in pushing moves in the United Nations to try to bring the conflict in Gaza to an end, I think that they will return to that role fairly soon, perhaps in the summer or the autumn, perhaps sooner still, given the urgency of the situation in Gaza. I think that Western leaders, for their part, are going to find that when diplomatic activity resumes in earnest, as it will over the next few weeks, they could find themselves in, shall we say, an embarrassing situation. And I suspect that the pressure, which eased off after Trump's election and the inauguration of, and his inauguration, the diplomatic pressure is going to renew with added force. And I suspect that as that starts to happen also, and as more information about what is going on in Gaza starts to trickle out, I think we will see growing protests in European countries and in the United States. In Britain, in particular, I'm aware of an uptick, a very significant uptick in protest activity as well. So that is what I think is going to happen over the next few weeks and months. I think this quiet period in the diplomacy is now coming to an end. I suspect that we're going to see renewed urgency over the next few weeks, especially in the second half of this year. And we'll see what the United States and European countries do in the face of that. Going back to Lindsey Graham's comments, if this is the best that he can come up with in order to basically shield his friends in Israel and elsewhere, and to push back against diplomatic moves, the kind of things that he was saying in that message that he posted on X, then all I can say is that he has no answers, he has no response, neither will the Western powers. And when I say that they will find themselves embarrassed, I am engaging in extreme understatement, because I am obliged, as always when I talk about this issue, to choose my words very, very carefully. Suffice to say, I think before long the heat is on, will be on. In the meantime, the events in Gaza are horrifying and harrowing, and the political leaders of the West should be ashamed of themselves sitting on their hands and letting it happen. As to the leaders of Israel, well, I have nothing to say about them at all. If I did, I would probably say things which I would prefer not to say in a program because, well, my feelings about this are so strong that I would say things that go beyond the kind of measured language that I prefer to use in these sort of programs. Anyway, that's what I wanted to say about the situation in Gaza at the present time. Now, I'm going to add one further comment, which is about the wider situation in the Middle East. And this is that we're getting all the time more information about what happened over the course of the 12-day war. There's been more information pouring out of the United States. I say pouring out because it's no longer just trickling out of the United States, talking about the massive rundown of US air defense missile stockpiles. Large numbers of standard anti-aircraft missiles were used to try to intercept Iranian ballistic missiles. It seems that the rundown in the THAAD missile inventory might have been, if anything, understated. It's now suggested, I believe by some, that up to a quarter of the stockpile of THAAD missiles was used up over the course of the 12-day war. That war was nowhere near as intense as I suspect it could have been, just saying. And beyond that, despite the heavy use of missiles, air defense missiles, by the United States and Israel and their allies to try to shoot down incoming Iranian ballistic missiles, as we now know, some got through and did more extensive damage in Israel than was being reported at the time. The word also continues to be that Iranian missile stockpiles remain enormous and that production of missiles in Iran continues at an intense rate. Now, Iranian officials have made contradictory statements about the damage done to their facilities. There was a report apparently in the United States which suggested that whilst Fordow might have been damaged to the point where it would take 2 years to bring it back to a state of repair, damage to the facilities in Natanz and Isfahan was less extensive, and that there are tunnels and bunkers in those two facilities which are deeper, if anything, than the ones in Fordow, and that the United States and its bombs were not able to reach that far. The Iranians sometimes give the impression that the damage to these facilities, though extensive, was not so extensive that they couldn't be brought back into a state of production fairly soon. At other times, as in recent comments by the Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi, they sort of imply that the damage might not have been quite so bad. At other times, as in recent comments by their Foreign Minister, Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi, they seem to endorse Donald Trump's claim that the actual facilities, were in fact entirely destroyed. The supreme leader of Iran, Ayatollah Khamenei, has, however, reiterated that Iran will be able to continue its nuclear enrichment program, and the president of Iran, President Pezeshkian, he's come out and said the same thing. He said that regardless of how extensive or not the damage to the facilities was, the fact is that the Iranians know how to enrich uranium now. The knowledge is in their minds, and that they will not give up on it. As I said in earlier programs, I get the strong impression that the Iranians are stringing the Americans along. They don't want another attack at the present time. They're in the process of rebuilding their air defenses and organizing their forces. There are reports that they've imported air defense missiles from China. And as I discussed a few programs ago, Khamenei's chief foreign policy aide, Ali Larijani, and the Iranian defense minister have been on a trip to Moscow, a recent trip to Moscow, where they've had a meeting both with the Russian defense minister, Andrei Belousov, and with President Putin himself. And all the indications are that the Iranians are now earnestly working with their friends in Moscow and Beijing to try to build up their defenses. So they probably need time, and that's, I suspect, why they're stringing the Americans along, why they're trying to keep the Americans uncertain as to the full extent of the damage that was done. They're also playing the same game, by the way, with the International Atomic Energy Agency. The International Atomic Energy Agency has come in for a lot of criticism from Iran for its role in providing information to Israel and the United States, which facilitated the attacks on the nuclear facilities in Iran. The Iranians are furious with the conduct of the IAEA and of its chief, Rafael Grossi, in the run-up to the attack, raking up issues relating to Iran's nuclear program of 25 years ago and bringing that up again in a way that appeared to justify the Israeli and American attacks on Iran. However, the Iranians, having made statements that they're not going to cooperate with the IAEA in future, that they're not going to allow the IAEA to inspect or tour their nuclear sites, nonetheless have invited a delegation of the IAEA to Iran and are going to meet with them or will meet with them. But apparently they made it clear that the Iranian position, that there will not be any actual inspection of their nuclear sites, that still stands. The Iranians at the same time are also playing a game about diplomacy with the United States. They are saying that they do expect diplomacy to resume, or to be more precise, that they're open to restarting talks with the United States. But at the same time, they continue to insist for guarantees from the United States, for compensation for the damage that was done to Iran, for punishment of Israel, which of course the United States is never going to agree to. So you could see what the Iranians are doing, and it is not surprising. They will need time to re-establish and rebuild a functioning air defense system, one which they must hope will be better capable of absorbing any future attack by Israel and the United States than the original air defense system that the Iranians had, which failed entirely over the course of the 12-day war. So that's what the Iranians are doing. But perhaps in the middle of all of this, a specific comment made in an interview by President Pezeshkian, the president of Iran, went unnoticed, because President Pezeshkian said that he does not expect any agreement with the United States or Israel. He fully expects the fighting, the conflict to resume, and he says that this conflict will continue, and he doesn't seem to think that Iran has gained anything from the ceasefire except a temporary pause, which it is using in order to reorganize and to rearm. So, quite apart from the fact that we're likely to see more diplomatic activity, shortly focusing on the Gaza issue, there's a high probability also that sometime in the autumn we will see simultaneously with that a resumption of the conflict between Israel and Iran, possibly with the United States becoming involved as well. And given the difficulties the United States and Israel had shooting down Iranian ballistic missiles, and given the general shortage of air defense interceptors that they are now gradually starting to admit to, the extraordinary rate of depletion of air defense interceptors over the course of the 12-day war, I expect that this combination of intensified diplomatic activity and likely conflict with Iran could make the second half of this year, the period after the summer holidays, the period starting from September, an extremely tense one, an extremely intense one, with high probabilities of significant impacts also on the state of the global economy and maybe on the state of the oil price. So we should look forward to, shall we say, a hot autumn in the Middle East and globally as well. And I don't get the sense that Western governments are ready for it, are preparing for it in any way. For the record, there was a meeting between Iran and the Europeans, or at least so I understand. But from what I can tell, given this slight amount of information about that meeting, it appears that nothing came of it. Anyway, that's what I wanted to say for the moment about the situation in the Middle East. I'm now going to turn to the situation in Ukraine, which is also rapidly moving towards a crisis point, or so it seems to me. Firstly, it's perhaps worth pointing out a certain fact about Ukraine's economic situation, which is not perhaps getting the degree of attention that it merits, but which the former Ukrainian politician Viktor Medvedchuk, currently in exile in Russia, yesterday reminded us of. This is that in June of this year, Ukraine defaulted on repayment of some of its loans, and S&P, Standard and Poor, has actually reduced Ukraine's credit rating to D for default. Now, I say that because, of course, every single day, every single week, we hear more demands from Ukraine for more money to be funneled to Ukraine. The International Monetary Fund, the World Bank continue to send money to Ukraine. They are doing so to a country which is already in a state of default, where inflation, by the way, is already running at 15%, where there are growing problems apparently paying salaries of civil servants and military and of the military. This has been a deepening problem since the United States basically cut off that funding earlier this year. The European Union, which in effect means Germany, have promised to make the difference, but they're struggling to. Anyway, money continues to be sent to Ukraine, despite the fact that the country is technically in default on its international debt obligations. In the case of the IMF and the World Bank, it seems to me that the fact that they continue to support Ukraine, despite the fact that the country is in default, is in clear breach of their charters. They ought to at least take the fact of Ukraine's default into account and perhaps put together some kind of recovery plan before lending further sums to Ukraine. But in practice, of course, they never do. They just go on writing the checks, which are, of course, checks drawn on the accounts of Western taxpayers. Just to say. Now, I mention all of this because, of course, the whole issue of Zelensky's decision to bring the two anti-corruption agencies, SAPO and NABU, under the control of the prosecutor's office, as I discussed in my program yesterday, is largely, as far as he is concerned, a matter of controlling money flows. And of course, the one thing that he will not want, above all, is the flow of money from the West to stop. And as I discussed again extensively in my program yesterday, if he's going to make any concessions at all about the status of NABU and SOPA, it is not because of the relatively small protests that have taken place in Ukraine up to this time, but much more because of the dismay on the part of European governments and of the European Commission at what he has done. As of this time, however, we still have no details about whatever modification to his law taking control of NABU and SOPA he actually intends to make. The Ukrainian parliament is in recess for the summer. It would presumably have to be brought back into session in order to pass any new law. Apparently, Ukrainian MPs, who for their own very personal reasons do not like NABU and SOPA, have been communicating to Zelensky the fact that they do not want the legal position of NABU and SOPA to be restored to that position of independence, so-called independence, Western control, that they enjoyed just, say, 2 weeks ago. So we will see what exactly it is that Zelensky intends to do. My guess, as I said in my program yesterday, is that whatever new law is indeed put in place, it will simply sugarcoat the fact that he's brought these two agencies under his direct control. There might be some reorganization of the structure so that they come under his direct control rather than under the control of the Prosecutor General. But I don't think that there will be any change of substance on what he has done. And for the record, I don't believe that European governments are ultimately going to change their position with respect to Ukraine. None of the big European governments at the moment appear willing to pull the plug on Ukraine, on Project Ukraine, and on Zelensky in that sort of way. In fact, I was sent over the last couple of hours a video film of an interview that the German Chancellor Friedrich Merz has just given, in which he speaks with extraordinary hostility about Hungary and Slovakia. He appears to make threats against them of depriving them with funding. He says it is completely outrageous that these two small countries should obstruct in any way what is the general policy of the European Union, apparently disregarding the fact that according to the EU's own structures, foreign policy is supposed to be agreed collectively and unanimously by all member states. Apparently, as far as Merz is concerned, there is a hierarchy of member states, and Slovakia and Hungary are at the bottom of it. None of us, of course, who have followed the realities of the European Union over the last 20 or so years have ever been in any doubt about that. But it was extraordinary to see the German Chancellor talking in this extraordinarily threatening way and letting the mask drop quite so openly and exposing the realities. But putting that aside, the way in which Merz was discussing the whole topic made it fairly clear to me that he continues to be completely committed to Ukraine, to Zelensky, to the project in Ukraine, the Western project in Ukraine. There was no hint there of any kind of concession or relaxation of support. No doubt he has spoken out against Zelensky's moves, against the anti-corruption agencies. But I don't myself think he's going to let that stand in his way any more than he lets the fact that Ukraine has already defaulted on its loans and has a D rating, a default rating, that is letting him stand, that's letting that stand in his way either. So I think that Zelensky will call the Europeans bluff. As I said, he will sugarcoat what he has done, but I don't think the fundamental reality of what he has done will change. He's made some public comments, by the way, which I'll return to shortly. I mean, Zelensky is one of these people who makes some kind of public comment every single day, in sharp contrast to Putin, who measures his comments very carefully. Zelensky is always talking. He speaks every day. He writes things on X. He gives interviews. He makes public television addresses. He's constantly there. I think the Ukrainian people have long since tired of the stream of words that comes from him. But for the record, it continues. Anyway, he continued, I notice, in the same comments which he made about the fact that he's heeded the public and will modify the law that he has just enacted, taking control of Nabu and Sopa. He spoke about, nonetheless, the importance of cleansing these two agencies of Russian influence. That was his original excuse for his law, for the power grab, for the taking of these two agencies under his control that he gave. I don't think anybody takes that seriously. I don't see any evidence that Nabu and Sopa have any Russian influence at all. They are European and American, largely European and American run agencies, with some Ukrainians, of course, also involved. I don't see any evidence that the Russians are involved in them in some ways. There's been some speculation, by the way, that what triggered his attacks on these agencies is that they've begun probes on some members of his inner circle. But I would say that this has happened before. It isn't new. And my own view is that the reality is that in Ukraine, at any one time, somebody, if you're talking about the political elite, somebody is always investigating someone. And I don't think too much should be made of that. But anyway, the fact that Zelensky is still talking about the importance of cleansing these agencies of Russian influence suggests very strongly to me that he still intends to have them directly controlled by himself. There is no other reason for him to say something like that than that he intends to control them, ultimately to control them as always. Now, all of this, as I discussed in my program yesterday, distracts attention from what really matters, which is the situation on the front lines. And here, the situation is continuing and accelerating constantly. The Russian offensive, in my opinion, has not reached full flood. I think there is still a long way to go before that happens. The two big reserve armies, for example, have not been committed to the battle so far. The Russians have built up huge forces. They've been sending most of the armor and equipment that they've been producing to build up the various reserve armies on Russian territory. So there's no sign or word at the moment that these have been committed in any direct way. But despite that, more I suspect because of the growing weakness of the Ukrainians. But of course, and as I also discussed yesterday in my program, because of the growing proficiency of the Russians, the Russian offensive continues to gain momentum. And it is doing so now in 3 places. We've had dramatic information about developments in 3 separate places. One is Pokrovsk, and of course that is perhaps the single most important battle. It is the one which I suspect overshadows all of the others. And the reports about the state of the Ukrainians, the state of the Ukrainian forces which are defending Pokrovsk, suggest growing confusion and disorganization and panic. There are further reports, very little in the way of video confirmation, that the Russians have now established control of a significant section of southwestern Pokrovsk. The major Russian advance into Pokrovsk for the moment is from the southwest. The Russians have been entering Pokrovsk from the southwest and are gaining steady ground there. But there is also the Russian advance into Mirnograd from the south. Most likely the Russians, who have just captured Novoekonomichny, are preparing for an attack on the Dimitrov coal mine, which is located between Novoekonomichny and Mirnograd. So it is likely that there will be a Russian attack on Mirnograd itself as well. And there continues to be the enigma and the alarm about the steady increase in territory being captured by the Russians, not just east of Pokrovsk, but I think we're entitled increasingly now to say north of Pokrovsk as well. There is speculation that the Russians intend to advance into Pokrovsk itself from the north, that once they've captured, captured Rodinska, the village immediately to the north of Pokrovsk that lies on the main road leading into Rodinska, that their forces will move south and will launch an assault upon Pokrovsk from the north, in which case we will have 3 attacks on Pokrovsk, one from the southwest, one from the east, from Mirnograd, and one from the north as well. Now, this is very, very typical of the way the Russians storm cities now. They like to conduct multiple assaults from many different directions, keeping the Ukrainian garrison disorganized and overextended and uncertain where the attack is coming, the big attack is coming. But beyond that, beyond the fact that there seems to be Russian moves ultimately to capture Rodinske. As I discussed in my program yesterday, Redovka is talking about the Russians now encircling Rodinske. The Russians continue to move northwards. They seem to be moving steadily towards the town of Dobropilia and Shachove, immediately to the north of these places, all of which suggests that the Russians not only are intending to cut off Pokrovsk, the supplies to Pokrovsk from the north, but that they're also intending eventually further advances north of Pokrovsk as well. So it's a complicated picture, but the information from Pokrovsk speaks of an increasingly difficult situation for the Ukrainians in that town. The situation there seems to be becoming increasingly closer, is moving increasingly closer to crisis. And though I'm not going to give a timeline for how long this battle is going to continue, the Russian authorities are keeping very, very tight control on the flow of information coming out of Pokrovsk. There is no Prigozhin-style personality giving us daily updates about what is happening in the way that Prigozhin did when he led the assault with his Wagner forces on Bakhmut in the spring of 2023. So, as I said, there's little detailed information about what is happening in Pokrovsk. A lot of it depends now on updates from the various mapping projects, the Ukrainian ones and the Russian ones, and rumors that circulate from Telegram channels that appear to be closely connected to various military units involved in the battle. So I don't think there's enough information to give a precise picture of what is exactly happening, but the general trend of events clearly points, I would have thought, to a relatively early collapse. And if Pokrovsk, the defences of Pokrovsk, were to implode in, say, a week's time, I would not be surprised, though I'm not predicting that it will happen within that time. Now, if the situation in Pokrovsk is difficult to decipher, the same is equally true about the situation in Kupiansk, right at the other end of the battlefronts. Here there is, again, intense fighting going on. There are reports this morning that the Russians have captured more villages and positions south and west of Kupiansk, that the ring around Kupiansk is tightening. There were reports that I mentioned about a week ago, which appeared in TASS, that there was actual street fighting going on in Kupiansk. As I said, film from Kupiansk yesterday confirmed it, and it does seem as if the Russians now do hold and have consolidated positions in the northern part of this town. Again, the reports are very sketchy, but they suggest that the Russians are indeed now storming Kupiansk, and that their objective is to capture Kupiansk. This is no longer a battle of maneuver, that they've reached that point where they feel that the moment has finally come to end the battles, the various battles that have raged around Kupiansk for quite a long time now. But again, it's very, very difficult to get a clear picture of exactly what is happening. But the reports this morning, difficult as they are for me to fully understand, all speak of significant Russian advances in Kupiansk and of a disorganized and chaotic Ukrainian defense, not that different from the defense of Pokrovsk. Kupiansk, of course, is nowhere near as important in the overall strategy of things as Pokrovsk is. The importance of Kupiansk is that it can lead to other places, Izium, Balaklaya, Liman, Pokrovsk, by contrast, in some respects, an isolated town. Its capture, as military people say, will open for the Russians operational space, allowing them to advance north, outflanking the Ukrainian forces in Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, and potentially west as well. And here again, there are some reports that the Russians have made major advances westwards in their advance to the Dnieper. Some of the telegram channels connected to the Russian forces that are located in this area are saying that over the next couple of days, or maybe even tomorrow, they will be providing a lot of further news about these Russian advances. But again, it's difficult to get a clear picture because, again, I get the sense that the Russian authorities are exerting a very tight control over the information space. One area where we can speak of Russian advances and where we have visual confirmation of this is the Siversk area. The Russians have produced lots of film and pictures of their soldiers operating, as far as I can tell, in all of the areas of the so-called Serebyanka forest. This has been a forest which the Russians captured in 2022, then the Ukrainians recaptured it as a result of the autumn 2022 Kharkiv offensive. Then there's been lots of encounter battles during that time, where the Russians at various times appearing to advance towards to Siversk itself, and at various times claiming that they'd captured the villages of Grigorovka and Serebyanka to the northeast of Siversk. The general picture is that whatever advances the Russians might have achieved since 2022 were always ephemeral. The Ukrainians ultimately were always able to regain control, and until a few weeks ago, the Serebyanka forest, as well as the villages of Grigorovka and Serebyanka, were clearly under Ukrainian control. Now, some weeks ago, the Russians captured the village of Grigorovka. They have control of another village, important village called Kupiansk, which is located to the south, immediately to the west of Siversk. There's been fighting underway for some time in the village of Serebyanka itself. It's often said that in order to gain control of the village of Serebyanka, secure control of the village of Serebyanka, the Russians need to capture the Serebyanka forest. I'm not able to explain the reasoning for this, but anyway, the film that's appeared today showing the Russian soldiers in different parts of the forest raising their red flags, their various flags. Some of them are red, some of them are not. But anyway, raising their flags in the Serebyanka forest, that those all suggest that the Serebyanka forest is now indeed under Russian control, which presumably means that the village of Serebyanka is also soon likely to fall. In which case, a Russian attack on Siversk cannot be far, and there are lots of reports for which we do not have film footage that the Russians also are now in the process of storming a village called Kolodizy, very near to the town of Liman, in which case with Siversk and Liman having fallen, the way would be open again for a Russian attack on Slavyansk. And of course, if the Russians are back in control of Kupiansk, then presumably they can soon recapture Izium and Balakleya, again surrounding Slavyansk from the north, all of the territory which the Ukrainians regained in their famous Kharkiv offensive of the autumn of 2022 would at that point have been lost. Anyway, complicated battles, but the situation overall is of a Russian offensive that is continuing to gain momentum right across the front lines, and of a Ukrainian resistance that continues to be ragged. Now, you would not get that impression if you listen to Zelensky. I said that he speaks all the time. He spoke yesterday. He said that he'd recently had consultations with his military leaders. The first topic of discussion was Pokrovsk. He didn't say very much about that. He spoke about battles taking place in other places without giving any clue as to what was going on. But he mentioned also the fact that the Ukrainian forces continue to fight on Russian territory. He didn't say where, and to my mind, that gives overall a clear sense that whatever it is that Zelensky says about the military situation is, shall we say, unreliable. Because as far as I am aware, there are no Ukrainian forces now stationed on any Russian territory. I mean pre-2014 Russian territory. Anywhere at all. There are no Ukrainian forces in Belgorod region or Kursk region or in any other place. The Ukrainians did make multiple attempts to capture this village of Totkino in Kursk region. Those attacks continued until a few weeks ago. The Ukrainians never succeeded in capturing that village, and they apparently have abandoned their attempts to do so and have pulled back from that territory. And in fact, if anything, some reports say that the Russians have crossed into Ukrainian territory from Kursk region, precisely in this area of the village of Totkino. Now that, of course, begs the question, does Zelensky believe that the Ukrainians do still have a presence on Russian territory somewhere, in which case he's not just delusional, but is presumably being lied to by his commanders, or whether he is also delusional, but telling Ukrainian society things which are simply untrue. Well, I am not going to try to get into Zelensky's mind. I consider that a hopeless attempt, hopeless thing to do. So as I said, I have no idea what exactly is going on in Zelensky's mind, what he believes. But as far as I know, there are no Ukrainian troops on Russian territory at all, anywhere at this particular time. Anyway, there it is. The Russians continue their advances on the front lines. And if this pressure continues, we're still in July. There's August, September, October still to go. Then there will be the Rasputitsa, the period of the autumn mud. Then after that period, the Russians, as they showed during 2023, 2024, and by the way, 2024, 2025, in the winter in those winter periods, the Russians are still capable of conducting advances during that time. But we're still at a relatively early point or so, I think, in the Russian offensive. If the pressure continues even at the current rate, then we're going to see a breakdown in the Ukrainian defenses in Donbass at some point, probably reasonably soon. And of course, if the pressure increases further, then that breakdown will simply happen even faster. There's been much speculation about whether the Russians would be able to capture the whole of Donbass this year. I'm starting to think that that objective is now coming within reach. Of course, if the Russians capture the entire Donbass region this year, then of course the way to advance towards the Dnieper in Ukraine's central regions is open, and I am going to say that in that case, Ukrainian defenses in the northeast of Ukraine, in Kharkov and Sumy and Chernigov regions, would be at serious risk of being outflanked and ultimately, I suspect, even destroyed. So anyway, we may be closer to this point than I think many people expected at the start of the year. We shall see. I would remind people that back in the autumn of 2023, the Russian Defense Ministry released brief footage of the then Russian Defense Minister, Sergei Shoigu. He's now the Secretary of Russia's Security Council, but they released footage of Shoigu saying, or appearing to say, that the Russians needed to complete their plan for Ukraine, and the indications were that the plan envisaged the end of the special military operation in 2026. It seems to me that if that is the Russian timetable, at the moment they look like they're keeping it. Anyway, there's been a number of other things that perhaps one should say at this point. Firstly, the European Union and the Chinese had their meeting. President Xi Jinping of China had met with the European leaders, with President Costa, the President of the European Council, and Ursula von der Leyen, the President of the European Commission, in Beijing. Photographs have been published showing the three of them together. The Chinese government has published a readout of the meeting, which I have to say was extraordinarily vague. It didn't give any indication at all that anything of any significance had actually been said or agreed over the course of these meetings. The reports suggest that the meetings between the Europeans and the Chinese didn't go well at all. The meeting only lasted a single day. Previous summit meetings between the EU and China have been much more protracted affairs. And I say that the meeting didn't last, only lasted a day. That is probably an understatement. In fact, it seems that it didn't last very long, even over the course of that day. It seems as if China and the EU found no common ground on any issue, on competition issues, on various other policies. The Europeans brought up again supposed Chinese support for Russia in the conflict in Ukraine. They found the Chinese completely immovable on this issue. Now, Reuters has published a piece saying that Donald Trump is most unlikely to move forward with his threat to impose 100% tariffs on countries that continue to buy Russian oil. And that, of course, means China first and foremost, but also India and Turkey and others as well. And the reason that Donald Trump is most unlikely to do this is because this would create a massive crisis in the global economy. And Donald Trump will not want that because of the effects that it would have on his standing, his popular standing in the United States. Well, I've been saying that for a long time, ever since this strange idea was first proposed. In fact, ever since Senators Graham and Blumenthal came up with their bone-crushing sanctions idea. Reuters has finally caught up with this. I'm not seeing any pushback from the Trump administration against this article. I'm not saying definitely that we will see no sanctions or tariffs in September, but it seems unlikely. Speaker Johnson, by the way, the Speaker of the House of Representatives, has sent Congress, or at least the House of Representatives, on leave until the 2nd of September. I suspect the Senate can probably still meet over the course of August. But given what Johnson has done, I don't think that he is keen to have this sanctions bill that Blumenthal and Graham are putting together put before the House. And obviously now that can't happen until September anyway, buying Trump more time. Foreign policy, the heavyweight US International Affairs magazine, has come out with a long piece talking about the end of sanctions and saying that oil sanctions have proved consistently ineffective when they were applied against against Russia and Iran. Both of these countries were able successfully to bypass them. And I think that is true. So there may be some sanctions in September by the United States, but I can't really see it happen. It looks to me as if the Chinese have again called the bluff on this threat of sanctions. The Europeans are getting nowhere with the Chinese in trying to get the Chinese to lean on the Russians. The Americans, I'm sure, will find the same. It looks to me as if it is the military situation that is going to dictate the outcome of this war. Now, that brings me back to the earlier points that I was making over the course of this program. It's likely that we're going to see intense diplomatic activity about the situation in the Middle East in the autumn. It is highly likely that we're also going to see a renewal of the conflict in the Middle East between Israel and Iran in the autumn as well. And it is also likely in the autumn that we're going to see major developments on the battlefronts in Ukraine and a sense of crisis develop about Ukraine as well. I'm not predicting all this. It's never possible to give definite predictions about events. But it seems to me quite likely that that is where events are going to take us. We could be looking at an extremely stormy autumn indeed. Well, this is where I finish today's program. Be more from me soon. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop, links under this video. Please remember, if you've liked this video, to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.